And so, Abbot True, with Greogair's agreement, made changes to Osrith's lethal at Caerleguilid, for she was under King Guthred's protection. As they explained what that meant, Osrith couldn't help wondering how a king that they hadn't seen for nearly 6 weeks could actually protect her. No matter what King Domhnall and King had allowed her to do, it was unsuitable for her to remain sleeping next to Tagged and Fergus in the hayloft she was to reside, alone, in the scriptorium for the gale's duration at Caerleguilid. She had stood before the abbot as he restricted where she could and could not go, but Osrith put her foot down at being prevented from training, or having her weapons taken. She had fought, and fought well, against Danes and Norse. Tagged and Fergus had vouched for this. And she had fought against the Rus, though fought was hardly praise here. A child with USTCK might have bettered some of the rowdy Strathclyde Cymru raiders. She was not prevented from eating with the warriors, however. As she turned to go, Abbot True called put one last question. And you are ... How old? 15, Osrith answered, as True and Greogair exchanged a look. And you truly fight? Osrith could see that though True genuinely looked impressed, he tried not to show it. He knows you couldn't have taken his woman, Kevin said, the next morning, after she had spent a strange night alone in the scriptorium. Not now, though. The abbot spoke to him. It could have just been an amusing misunderstanding, Osrith thought, but she had been taken from her comrades, and the royal guard had spited her by taking her plate the following night. Half made to replenish it, but Osrith had got to her feet and excused herself, still hungry, thinking how the girl would inflame the situation like that. In the end, Tagged thrown up a rope to Osrith to the scriptorium room and had her pull on it. She had been rewarded with bread and meat, all wrapped up neatly in a cloth, with a stone jar of water. Her heart soared that her friends had remembered and, as the week went on, resigned herself to remaining in the scriptorium while the dust settled. And, being up in the tower was little hardship. From the bed in a tiny alcove, locked at night and opened at dawn, she could see the stars, and spy clouds, and tiny pinpricks of light in the distance of minute settlements in Strathclyde. She laughed that the little heathen Christian girl had mistaken her for a boy, and hoped she and the Dane made one another happy. And Osrith also realized that she was developing feelings for Tagged. His voice had never caused her stomach to lurch as it did one morning as they practiced fighting, nor his hand the tingling sensation when it had brushed hers one evening reaching for the ale. That night, all her energy was put into humping herself. Beads of sweat formed on her brow as her thighs crushed the nub of highly sensitive nerves between her legs with her breeches, thinking they might be about to tear as she rode the fabric until she came, and then forced her body to elicit more release with sheer force of will until her cunt ached, her hips felt weak and her legs shook as she made to stand, the sunrise taking on her blush as guilty thoughts imagined it were Tagged's hands pleasuring her. But she would be shoulder to shoulder as a warrior, first, Osrith knew, rather than a lover, and determined never to tell him her feelings, nor yet act on them, only by herself. Kevin brought her more artifacts and she learned that in the year 597, when Comsil, the founder of the Lindisfarne monastery under Oswald, the Augustan mission began at Thanet. Crimthane, he was called, enthused Kevin, pointing to Comsil's nickname. It is Gaelish. Irish. Do you know its meaning? Wolf, Osrith replied, tracing the words with her finger. Ah, it's as I suspected, mused Kevin, wryly, and went on to tell her his hypothesis, that Comsil arrived at Iona not by accident but by arrangement. Sainid Mac Alpin did not conquer the Picts alone. His ancestor through Comsil had, first of all, converted to Christianity the Cymry of Pitland and Strathclyde. Gaelicization. Osrith nodded. It made sense. It was why her ancestor, Oswald, had brought the Irish Church to Northumbria, power, and why his brother Oswy had turned to the Augustine Church, more power, through the Merovingian royals in Francia and wealth and influence. Which is why the Domhnall has resisted the Augustan Church, and why there is so much conflict between Alba and Northumbria, she added. Kevin gave her a toothy smile. You are very perceptive, he agreed. It allowed him to break from Fina, to marry Rhianmulth, bring Cumbrail and, once into August in Christianity. Akar, his sister, had turned down a marriage offer from a Gaelish warrior. The Gaels were getting too strong. Oswy changed this despite having been cared for by the Gaels, as Oswald. They had been Gaelish warriors, despite being English princes. "I am a Gaelish warrior," Osrith declared. "I am here for King Domhnall." "But you are not Gaelish," replied Kevin. "I can tell by the way you speak English and Cymric." "I am a skilled Gaelish warrior who has had the fortune to be educated and allowed access to your scriptorium." "And are you an English prince, too?" Kevin chuckled. "I did see you how you fought the Ras. Hamin arm gaze jeet Gaelic widely," she added, in Cymric. "I meant no offense, boy," the monk said, folding the scroll they had just been reading. "Girl," Osrith conceded. "An English orphan girl who happened to kill a Dane who was threatening Constantine, and defending him." "Did you really?" Kevin looked at Osrith, impressed. "You are with the Lord Grioghair?" Kevin shook his head. And, it wasn't until much later, under much different circumstances, that Osrith would understand Kevin's next words, ones we've made no sense to her then. "Funny," he said, "how Garrick was once loyal to Eochaid." And then he turned to another script, showing Osrith that, in exile when Oswald was king, Edwin had a fleet at Caerleguilad and had turned Domhnall Brec's allegiance to him, conquering both Anglesey and Man, both of which now were in Norse hands. "It is the way of now," Kevin explained. "Those with the most strength prevail. Guthred is king because Eardred, the previous abbot, had dreamed his face. But, he was probably just dreaming about power." Harthnut, Guthred's father, was a brave warrior, who died fighting Eochaid in a border dispute. It was hoped that Guthred would be as successful. Osrith did not mistake the monk's words. "Hoped." He has made some mistakes, one which resulted in the death of Abbot Eardred as he tried to wed Guthred's sister to Elfric of Bibbenberg and lost him his allegiance and the alliance of two Norse brothers who have since been a bane to the people of Cumbraland. He lost his sister to the slave he should not have sold. In fact, it is just because he is a Christian, and Alfred of Winchester favours a Christian on the throne of Eothwic, and therefore Northumbria, that Guthred is not dead. And, Kevin added, brightly, smiling at Osrith, everyone deserved a second chance now, do they not? He is certainly getting one through Domhnall, Osrith thought. A chance to kill his former master? An enemy's enemy is a strong ally. And she had heard of the two Norse brothers. They had raided Strathclyde, Pitland, with Harold Finehair until the Mormers of Pitland had defeated him, and they had also raided into Dulriadan territory. It made sense. If she had been Domhnall, Osrith would have done the same. The Cymric fight back. Just look at the Pictish throne now. Two Cymry share ownership. Garrick, they say, murdered King Maxain Tildilpin to take the throne, which cleared the way for Eochaid. Comsil's unity under Christianity only went so far. He handed her an illuminated page. But, Osrith stared at him. Garrick ... who is on the Pictish throne now, with Eochaid ... murdered. Why, yes, of course. That is what your king is avenging, is it not? The assassination of his predecessor, not without considerable tribute to Guthred, of course, which he badly needs. But Osrith was still reeling. It was true that monks really were gossips, but she would never have known that if Kevin hadn't told her, amongst many other things. Did Domhnall really know of the assassination? Surely he must do ... And Garrick, that small, wily-eyed man who had little to say but plenty to learn when Domhnall and Constantine were in retreat and they had gone to Eochaid's palace at Glashcu. Could that be why they had had to flee? Because Domhnall had discovered it? It was such thoughts that were still of Osrith's mind as she watched, from the back of the kitchens the next morning, 2 weeks into Advent, Brother Given pounding up the steps of the scriptorium. She was trying to warm up as the spring was very cold that morning and she had kicked a small stone into it to check its depth, as Haf's father's WPRDS had stuck with her and, sure enough, as the cook had said, though she strained to hear, Osrith could not hear the stone blink to the bottom. Osrith, the monk called and, dressing quickly, waved a hand. You're up, he said, hurrying across the courtyard, yet another array of facts to tell her. It was not to be. Osrith, who had seen the small, rotund frame of Given raised a hand as guards rushed past them. One of them called and, shortly afterwards, Tagged and Fergus were by her. Britain's I'll be bound, called Given, cheerfully. They attack at dawn, mark my words. He called after the next guard who shouted the word, Osrith. Tagged and Fergus hurried after the king's guard, but not too fast. They had managed to repel the borderers last time easily, so they walked fast, in the wake of the guard, knowing their attack would be slovenly and dishevelled. Most of the guard would have got the first and would have repelled the majority. Riving keeps their hand practised, Tagged said, as they approached the main city gates. Then if Norse or Danes do attack, they at least stand a chance. Hey, are either of you? Then he heard what Osrith and Fergus had heard, the ear-splitting crash of the wooden palisade falling to the ground. Ear-splitting screams rent the dawn. Osrith ran towards the gate. It wasn't there. Both wood and oak barriers were in splinters, and around them, fleeing, were what remained of the poor of Caeleg as their homes burned. What Osrith was staring at, however, was none of that, but the foe. On the narrow strip of land taking up all of the available land were rows and rows of shields. In the center, at the very front, two warriors, dressed in fine white bearskin. Their hair, blonde and shimmering in the winter morning light, was braided and it fell to their shoulders. Osrith could guess who they were before even the shout of Norse arose from the top of the stone walls. These were the two Thurgilson brothers, and they were this absent king's enemy. 88,888,888. It was clear from the start things were not going well. Some of the guards, with no experience of a shield war, had run out, only to be dispatched efficiently by the front row. They don't know how to fight, Fergus yelled, as more men fell to the sword. Osrith looked across the shields, trying to estimate how many men the brothers had. It didn't seem a lot, and she hurtled past Tagged as she climbed the steps to the upper parapet as the guards up the raced in the opposite direction. No, there were no more hidden in dips in the land. Just before daybreak, then, the Norse must have ferried across the Idun from the north. But, what they had in the small aperture between the river's southern bank and the destroyed gate, 100, perhaps, would certainly be enough if the king's guard and warriors threw themselves to their deaths on the Norsemen's swords while they had to do nothing. Over the wall, Osrith could see Tagged, organizing some of the warriors who were coming down the other steps of the parapet. Fergus, too, was pointing, showing men at the other end of the line. Below her, other men were gathering, but they could not see what to do. Their leader was not there, or was killed, and neither was their king. Racing down, she established that most of the men were of the family class, the noble families of Sht, and she explained in Cymric that the men should line facing the Norse, and the second should fill in the gaps between the swords and shields of the first, the third filling in the gaps of the second row, and so on. They do not look like a full army, Osrith gasped, the words spitting from her mouth in her desperation to say them. There are none hiding, as far as I could see. Yes, one of the nobles said. Many were killed in the interior of Alba. Perhaps the brothers thought to chance their luck. Osrith watched the man do as she had instructed, as she pulled buay from her scabbard. Chance it they had, for the army at Caeleg had grown complacent and did not know even how to face a shield wall, let alone defeat one. At least now they might stand a chance. As she made to join the chaos, Osrith felt a hand on her shoulder, pulling her jerkin so she was held against the inner city wall. Expecting it to be Abbot True, or Grioghair, she had her reasons ready, to insist on fighting to battle their enemy. For, after all, King Guthred was her king's ally, and dash. But it was neither the abbot or Domhnall's man. Instead, her wits were enough to move as the Dane Galmi thrust a fist at her face. It hit the wall with a crunch which must have shattered bones. Osrith dashed past him, but, despite his roar of pain, the Dane caught her jerkin with the other hand, tearing at her shirt. She hit him round the head, but Galmi found what he sought, spying her breasts under her ragged shirt. He laughed, whether at the sight of her non-malness, or the realization that half's interest in Osrith was meaningless. He reached his injured hand out like a claw to touch one, but Osrith, angry, brought her knee up into his already hardening parts. "We fight the Norse." Osrith suggested adjusting her jerkin until she had managed to cover her tits, but did not wait for him, tearing out onto the battlefield, and assessing the scene. The Caligulid army were bettering the Norse. They had managed the line of the shield wall away from the gates, some had even driven a handful to the waterline of the river, hacking at them until they fell. Osrith saw part of the line that needed help, at the other end, where some of the central rows had pushed right and were causing the king's guard real trouble. "Stand fast!" Osrith roared, then continued to roar as she threw her battle anger behind two cutting strokes which solved the problem for one man who was losing ground. Both Norse fell with a thump, and Osrith called them on. "Kill them, and forward," she instructed, stepping over one of the Norse. Some of the men who must have been used to shield wall fighting pushed on, which encouraged most of the others. And they, after a time, had pushed the Norse to the edge of the river, some of the Norse preferring to try and reach their boats by swimming to them, which was futile as their armor, weighing them down, caused them to sink, and when they realized this, it was too late and they drowned. Osrith turned. They had concentrated the Norse attack in the center, and whoever was managing the Caligulid army on the right had concentrated on it, herding the Norse that were not already dead into a small area. And, from the parapet, Grioghair was coordinating archers. Those Norse able to fled under the hail of arrows, many, but not all, meeting the remaining shields. The two men Osrith supposed were the Thurgilson brothers were still ordering their demoralized men on from the front. Then, a horn sounded. It came from the boats. Evidently, some Norse had reached them and one was sounding a retreat. Amongst the Norse, a clatter of shields being lowered filled the air as the king's guard maneuvered round to face them. Osrith hurried round behind the guard. Something wasn't right. The Norse had raised their shields again and were leveling their swords. They hadn't given up. And, one of the Norse in the center seemed to be bearing down on one warrior in particular. She hurried around the rest of the king's guard, who were also heading that way. And, she flung herself in front of the warrior, who was on his knees, trying to protect himself with only a shield. Bué met the Norseman's sword, throwing it out of his hand. Whatever was going on, the warrior on his knees was on his knees, and the Norseman had not accepted his surrender but had been seconds away from killing him. But, now he was on the back foot. Osrith fought him with all her force, blades dashing either side of her with the king's guard matching them, stroke by stroke, as the Norseman thrust his blade towards her. Behind them, the horn sounded again, the blast lasting far longer. This time, the Norse lowered their weapons and shields, as did the warrior she was fighting. It was over. Caligulid had defeated a Norse attack. Osrith exhaled, breathing heavily as the Norseman was joined by another, darker-haired, taller as the first man lowered his blonde head. "You. Lord King," the second man spoke. Then, he put his hand to the other man's back. "My brother has something to say to you, King Guthard." Osrith turned in astonishment. The man on his knees had been the king of Cumbraland, and now it was the Norseman, one of the brothers, who had fought him to his knees who fell to his. "I, Eric Thurgilson, offer myself as a hostage, Lord King, to vouchsafe the peace you have won." "Accepted, King Guthard," pale gold-haired, pale-eyed Guthard said, in English, so his men could hear. And, as he stood to his full height, he eyed Osrith, who dipped her head in deference, said something in Danish. Osrith saw Eric the Norseman, one of the notorious brothers, led by King Guthard inside the walls of Caligulid.